Okay, so we are talking about the Great Peace of Montreal. So this is an event that the French decided to have, and their purpose for having this event is to try to build alliances with First Nations peoples. And so to do this, they invited over 1,300 Native people representing 40 different tribes. They met in Montreal, which is why it's called the Great Peace of Montreal. And the First Nations peoples tended to like the French better than the English. And there's a very important reason for this. The French were pretty happy just to stay in their small settlement along the St. Lawrence River. They weren't expanding very much. There were ships coming, but there weren't really all that many ships coming. And they were happy with the seigneuries that they had along the shoreline, and they were not pushing into the rest of North America. The English were quite different. There were 13 colonies of them. They were lots of settlers, lots of women, lots of children, lots of babies being born, lots of boats coming. And they were pushing further and further inland. And the First Nations people didn't like this because they could see the territories that they had traditionally been using to live their lives, hunt and gather and do all these things, being taken over and being converted into farmland and being converted into lands for these European peoples. And they didn't seem to be happy with what they had. The English always seemed to want more. They wanted more land, they wanted more space, they wanted to take more. And the First Nations peoples, for the most part, were happy to make a treaty with the French because they liked them better. Also, because the French tended to give them a little bit more respect, treat them a little bit nicer, a little bit less racist towards the First Nations peoples. The English were a little more racist. So, anyways, they had this great peace of Montreal. All these First Nations peoples came, and they made wampum belts. So the First Nations peoples didn't have written language. They didn't keep documents of over time. Everything that they did was oral. It was always an oral tradition of passing down information. So they would have these huge, elaborate stories that would be passed down from grandfather to grandson and generation after generation. That's how they remembered their history. They didn't write anything down. So, this idea of making a treaty, of writing on a piece of paper your words and then signing your name to the bottom of that, that's not something the First Nations peoples ever did. Instead, they had wampum belts. And the way the wampum belts worked is that um, they would make these very elaborate belts out of these shells, and each shell had to be like hand carved, and it was like really, really hard, meticulous work making these little beads that they would then weave together to make a pattern for this belt. And the wampum belt could be like this big or even bigger depending on what kind of treaty it was. But each tiny bead took so much time and effort that if both sides were working together to create this belt, they're putting a lot of their blood, sweat, and tears into the creation of this belt. And with every bead that they make, they're promising to honor the commitment of that belt. So the picture on the belt would often be a symbol of what was decided. So if the two, say there were two tribes that decided that they were going to share a parcel of land and they were going to both be able to do hunting on that piece of land, then they might have a dish with one spoon, meaning it's one piece of land is like the one dish, and the one spoon is like we get to share the food of this dish. We're going to both have turns taking from the spoon. Anyway, so they made wampum belts in the Great Peace of Montreal, and it was a big turning point for the relationship between First Nations and the French. Okay, so I'm going to slide down and talk about Acadia. So before I can talk about the loss of Acadia, I have to talk about what Acadia is. Acadia is, and I should have mentioned this earlier, it's a second French colony. It's not New France, it is Acadia. Oh, okay, we're approaching our free limit here. I am going to turn off this video and I'm going to start with Acadia in my next one. All right, guys, thank you. See you soon. And